I just want to welcome everyone to today's event. I know it's hard to stay out with beautiful weather outside and everything, but thank you for coming. My name is Nabil Khan, and I am the Muslim Students Association President here at Syracuse University. Today we're lucky to have our distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Kavakci is a consultant for the U.S. Congress on the Muslim world and a columnist for the Turkish daily newspaper, Yeni Akit. She sits at the editorial board of Mediterranean Quarterly. She is the author of Headscarves Politics in Turkey, a post-colonial reading, and 5 other books, some of which are translated into Arabic and Persian. After her lecture, we will have a brief question and answer session, so I please encourage everyone to please utilize that opportunity to ask any questions. And without further ado, Dr. Kavakci.
For this kind of introduction. Thank you, MSA, for getting me here. We wanted to do this for quite a long time, and alhamdulillah, today it must have been the day. I feel like I'm in one of my classes at the university, George Washington University. Today we will be talking about quite a large topic. Bear with me, you have before you a politician, so I may go on, and you might need to stop me. So just give me a heads up when the time is about to end. I hope that we will be able to tackle this question of the binarities and the binary oppositions that we see today within the Muslim world in the best possible way. Too prevalently voice theoretical perspectives of international relations that reign our world today are as follows. One of them has to do with the fact that we have ushered into the post-Cold War period. As you can imagine, a bipolar world was assumed where a superpower, or both of them now that we have one superpower, can exercise power, flex muscles against another embodiment, another enterprise there. So some argue that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States of America was going to find itself in that urgency of finding another place to exercise its power over. We may like it or not, that was one of the arguments in political theory. Another one, the one that was voiced by Professor Huntington, the very proverbial clash of civilizations, which pointed out to the fault lines being the major divisive force, be it cultural or otherwise. Yes, we had refuted Huntington's argument for a long time, but when the September 11th attacks occurred, one had to take a step back and think about, revisit the clash of civilizations arguments. Indeed, this time, post-September 11th world, raised various questions. Who are these people, to start with? As far as, in general terms, I'm talking about an average American person. Why are they so indignant? What's wrong with them? Where are they coming from? Philosophically, religiously, historically. I have to say, as tragic as the attacks were, if after so many years, if one has to find some sort of blessing in disguise, if you will, try hard and find that could be the sincerity of the American people to recognize that they just discovered a world of Muslims, until then may not have existed for most of them. And that roll up the sleeves and start learning about Islam. That's something that I personally cannot take for granted. Seeing this valuable recognition of ignorance on their part, and then immediately getting to work. This is a great trait that runs through the American people. In comparing and contrasting American people to some other peoples of the region, if you will, I find this to be a very important progressive trait. And therefore, classes, including my own classes on political Islam, on Turkey and European Union, on terrorism and so forth, students flocked universities, looking for some ways to understand the other, quote-unquote, the other. Now, in order to tackle the question of binarities within the Muslim world, indeed, we can utilize various approaches. These might be theologically based, politically, economically, and socially based. And please do not look for some stark, sharp lines that divide them. The political, social, and economic are very inextricable for one another. They go together in one camp. Sometimes theological and the rest also become very intertwined to one. From the perspective of theological approach, questions raised, involved, and they are still valid today. Does Islam condone violence? What's with the obsession with the Prophet of Islam? Of course, at another level. What's going on? Denmark cartoon craze, and then now this movie. Where are these people coming from, and what is the theological basis of this anger? How do they legitimize that kind of reaction, if you will? And there are some other questions. Is Islam inherently, intrinsically anti-democratic? Is there an exceptionalism that is rendered for Islam? We just have to accept it the way it is. There's some exception to Islam. On this first question about, for instance, violence, one caveat that accompanies is that the danger of decontextualization that runs through academia. It did run through, and it still does. Lack of historicizing is what we see. We take certain verses of Quran, certain sayings of the Prophet, and put them into a generalized context without making any references to the time and the history, the context within which it was used. Result, ubiquitous references to verses such as, kill them wherever you find them. Runs through Fox News, I'm sure, very often. Not a complete statement. No references to, if they're in peace with you, you be in peace with them. Or that the only legitimate use of force could come when you are, indeed paraphrasing in the sense, when you're taken out of your lands. About the issue of prophecy, to try to find some analogies between, say, another Abrahamic faith of Christianity and Islam would not get you much to a place. Depiction of the prophet is problematic to start with. Not to depict him with a turban that seems like a bomb on his head is another problem. But the depiction of him is the major problem that indignates the Muslim peoples. And indeed, it is not the only one, but it has a theological basis to it. On the second and the third questions about Islam being inherently, intrinsically anti-democratic and therefore deserves some sort of apologetic exceptionalism. We can utilize both the theological and socioeconomic and political approaches to search for answers. From the perspective of the credo of Islam, we can talk about democratic strands present in the tradition, not necessarily in a form and format that could be seen, that could come familiar to the people of 21st century. We're talking about 7th century, which has a message that is transcendental for until the day of judgment. But still, the form and format that it comes within can carry the traits of its own historical and timely context. Concept of shura, consultation, is a fundamental element of democracy. It is there, indeed. The constitution of the Medina city-state. You don't have to look for Magna Carta. From the perspective of the producers of knowledge and from the perspective of a community of knowers in the Muslim world, you can go back to 7th century and find the roots of a constitution within the Medina city-state. Indeed, to counter those democratic strands, some argue, some bring to the attention of this concept of bay'ah in Islam, which might be seen as an authoritarian strand, which can sort of, in a way, repeal the democratic traits. Bay'ah, paying allegiance, promising that you'll be there. Similar to our world's party discipline, if you will, in contemporary political machinery. From the perspective of socioeconomic approach and political approach, indeed we look at Islam's compatibility with democracy. This is the overarching question that runs through minds. And in there, what do we have in that democratization package that we can compare and contrast Islam against and measure it so we can render successful, compatible, or otherwise? The first thing is rule of law. Rule of law seemingly exists, it's there. Seemingly there. Why? Because there is guided pluralism, for one thing. There is controlled elections and selective repression. The kind of repression that you can hide away to save the face, if you will, whenever it is necessary. To back this observation out, we can throw in a few statistical numbers. If we will take Middle East, North Africa region to be the emblematic of the larger ummah, the Muslim world, we know today that Middle East, North Africa region stands out as the only region that was largely untouched by the third wave of democratization. That was also the only region where we had seen levels of freedom declining since 1970s. Not too far away, Freedom House, based in New York, tells us that when you rank these countries on a scale of 1 to 7, 7 being the least free, 1 being the most free, our very great allies, such as Egypt, until last year that is, Mubarak's Egypt, let's call it, ranked 6.6 out of 1 to 7 scale, 7 being the least free. Another great ally, Tunisia. I recall in the first Bush administration period, I think right after 2000, in early 2000s, when Bin Ali has visited the United States of America, President Bush was hailing him, praising him. That ranks 7 on that scale of 1 to 7. As far as accountability and transparency, the second and the third sort of sister elements that go together. In that package of democratization, we can immediately render unaccountable, untransparent to the Muslim world. Political machinery. And here, of course, as you can see, we're not just talking about the theology of Islam, Islam as a religion per se, but we're looking into the followers of Islam, their activities, just to be able to gauge if Islam is compatibility with democracy. So here we're moving into the lives of the Muslims and the political machineries that they had created throughout the region. And they are untransparent and unaccountable. That's, after all, what kept a man like Hosni Mubarak in power for 30 years. A man like Bin Ali for over 23 years. The corruption runs through. Last December, I had the pleasure of sharing the stage with the mother of Mohammed Bouazizi, where she and I were awarded some sort of by a human rights organization in Istanbul, and it was very thought-provoking to listen the story from the mother of this Mohammed Bouazizi, the vendor, street vendor, who had started the whole process out. The kind of measures Bin Ali regime had taken to appease, sequester, and put away what was coming onto them. The kind of bribing they offered to this family when she, all of a sudden, this middle-class woman finds herself at the middle of the palace. And she's thinking to herself, what am I doing here? And her son is in the hospital at the time. And then once they realized that bribing would not work, coercion, duress was the second tool they utilized. And that did not work as well. According to Corruption Index, Tunisia, that is Bin Ali's Tunisia, ranked 3.8 on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being the most corrupt. 3.8. And Egypt, Mubarak's Egypt, ranked 2.9. Again, it took only Sa'adeddin Ibrahim, a very secular sociologist of Egypt, a well-known author and political activist, to be imprisoned for President Bush to take a halt at hailing and praising Mubarak's Egypt. Now, on these 3 elements, this is the record. The record continues with the Islam democracy package looking into human rights. Human rights. How are we going to look at the Muslim world and argue that human rights do exist or do not exist there? And of course, within there, a large bulk of the enterprise, human rights enterprise, involves women's rights, Muslim women's rights. So human rights, as far as Muslim peoples are concerned, immediately has a string attached to it and a big parentheses and brackets, women's rights. So they are mutually inclusive. At this level, this course is conducted, when we look at it, at two facets. One might be theoretical, other one might be an empirical one. In theoretical level, one camp, of course, argues that Islam has liberated women. There's that romanticization of the Muslim history. Examples from the wives of the Prophet as liberated, emancipated, empowered women. The fact that an end to infanticide was put, and a move from women being a commodity into women's agency. And egalitarianism, as Islam claims, as subjects of God. It's something that came novel with the Islamic tradition. This camp argues at the theoretical level. The counter argument would come as Islam is empowering women, looking at the conceptual frameworks that deals with marriage, divorce, inheritance, and probably the most conspicuous and ostentatious symbol of the Muslim women, her hijab. Right? I mean, I do not want to make a generalization about this. It is not an American or European discourse, but in the larger Western world, this is a mind-boggling question. Why in the world would a woman want to cover herself? There must be something behind this. It just cannot be happening through her free will. Well, Islam is not an exceptional religion. And hijab is not exceptional to Muslim women. Counter-argument comes in. Christianity mandates that women cover. Judaism mandates that women cover. Islam mandates that women cover. That's why you have Muslim women, Christian women, Jewish women who do cover. And then the ones who choose not to cover. But it's there, so there is no need to look for an exceptionality. And then at the empirical level, the picture is much more confusing. Particularly when we look and zoom into women's areas. Of course, we're dealing with a heterogeneous mass of ummah, what we call the ummah. Their men are heterogeneous as well as the women. They come from different walks of life. And their perspectives on life and their take on religion are also very different. And then you look at the very empirical evidence of the sufferings of the Muslim women in the Muslim lands and unrefutable reality. To what extent are these partly caused by religion, the credo of Islam? To what extent are they caused by the culture, the construe of religion, and that key word of culture that comes and sometimes dominates and overrides religion. You'll find many cultural values entrenched in the Muslim world that are antithetical to the very religion of Islam. They're carried out from generation to generation in the name of Islam. To what extent are they the source of the problems? And then, to be a woman at this time and age on this earth is not an easy job for anybody. Be a Muslim woman, be a non-Muslim woman, be an atheist woman. So how much are these challenges are particular to the specificities of the Muslim world? All of these are questions unanswered. As far as heterogeneity is concerned, we can throw in a few numbers in there. Islam is very much blamed for keeping women, confining women into the household and keeping them sort of lagging behind the rest of the society. You You look at the female higher education rates throughout the Muslim world. Iran is 52%. Egypt, 34%. Saudi Arabia, 32%. Lebanon, 37%. Pakistan is 13%. And Morocco, which happens to be a locomotive and motorwork enterprise of the feminist women's movement, it is only 8%. In comparison to 11% of Czech Republic and 4% Brazil. So, is religion playing a particular role in women going into higher education? Is a question up for discussion. So there's a discrepancy right there. Majority of Muslim women do not necessarily yearn to become more like their Western counterparts. A Gallup poll tells us. While they favor gender parity, they likely want it on their own terms within their own societies, within their own cultural frameworks. Human rights record is also very bleak, just in general, for the Muslim world. Then one have to look into the major reasons behind it. Now we have these dictatorial regimes toppled by their peoples, we will have to wait and see who are the real culprits of these human rights violations against Muslims. Addition to this list, now this list, rule of law, accountability, transparency, human rights, women's rights, is a fundamental package of democratization. Now, as Western intellectuals, when Western thinkers, policymakers approach to the Muslim world with this list, they add in one more item to the list. They throw in one more. And actually, this almost comes and sits at the very top of the list as a sine qua non, as an indispensable element of democratization. And that is secularism. Secularism. And of course, we're talking about the Muslim world, meaning that marginalization of Islam is intended on part of the Western intellectuals, that we want to see Islam not play the kind of role that it is playing in the Muslim world. Well, interestingly, when it comes to separation of church and state, we find America, for instance, cutting a slack to themselves. I'm not going to be naive enough to ask, as I did when I first became a professor at George Washington University, to ask you if you consider United States of America a religious country or not, and if there is separation of church and state here, we can spend the night here then, right? But joking aside, we do cut a slack here to ourselves. And we see a similar looking away, if you will, when it is the Europeans, considering their commitment to Christianity. But definitely we want the Muslim world to be able to separate these two entities. But do we want the Muslim world to espouse and embrace the kind of separation of church and state similar to that of the Turkish, which I would rather call secular fundamentalism? Fundamentalism, but in a very secular format. We're trying to warn ourselves about dangers of extremism, religious that is, but we never think that there might be another kind of extremism in the form of secularization, where it becomes another taboo, a religion-like taboo, and very man-made taboo. At least in the other one, you have the divine coming in, from the perspective of the disciples, right? Or the one in Tunisia, as we applauded time and again, right? It's also an example of secular fundamentalism. What the Tunisian people endured under 23 years reign of Ben Ali, one has to go and talk to them about it, if they have the courage. Test your Tunisian friends. I have tested them. Even outside of the country, they will turn away and not want to talk, because the system is created in a way that the policing, political machinery, even if they speak here, their relatives can pay a price within the country. So they were all quiet about it. Or is it the kind of secularism which maybe we can call a more religion-friendly secularism, the kind that United States of America has embraced, espoused, in comparison to this very fundamental secularism. But we don't say that. It's very vague what we want them to do, but we definitely want them to secularize themselves. We're sure of ourselves and our religions, but not them. We cannot trust them and their religion. Now, when you look at the larger ummah, you also find that the ummah is very heterogeneous, not just their women. And there are some commonalities that they share among themselves. And the kind of information that I'm providing right now stands for the 90% of the world's 1.3 billion Muslims. So it's not a small sample where making generalizations and generalized inferences could be problematic. While acknowledging and admiring many aspects of Western democracy, Muslims do not favor a wholesale adoption of Western model of democracy. Among the top responses to what do you admire the least about the West? Generation of European Muslims who do not necessarily carry the baggage of being immigrants, who have the language and citizenship skills, unlike their parents and grandparents, who assume that they are as European as anybody else, but at the same time, Muslim. Europe is trying to come to terms with that reality. That being said, American Muslims do not depict a similar demography. American Muslims run above the average American life, so they belong to higher and higher middle classes of their societies. They're largely educated, and they are thinkers. Simply because most of them have come to United States of America or are from families who have migrated to this country for higher and higher, if not the best education. So they are, as far as their social and economic backgrounds are concerned, do not necessarily represent a stereotypical average American.
Get rid of your dictator. You can create all democratic institutions to give goods and services to people. If you do not have a process of democratizing the minds of people to come to a maturity that they can and they must and they will enjoy citizenship rights, that process will be hacked. So it'll be an internal challenge for the peoples of these lands. And I know this is not an easy process. And I know that, we all know that, and I do consultancy, and I try to be that bridge as much as possible on my part. And then when I mention that there is aid and a certain scholarship or assistance, financial or otherwise, available for the people working on the ground, in the field, in the Muslim world, the first question, is it from America? No. Thank you, but no thank you, would be the response. There's that kind of anti-Americanism running through many countries. That lack of trust is widespread. And therefore, American Muslims must unveil, if you will, repeal and mend that lack of trust through institutions, and there are many. There are many. I think this is a good point where I'll cut my speech. And if you have any questions,